Hello again. Welcome to the channel. Please subscribe. You'll get notified of things. Well, I hope you will. This one's called Sowing Seeds of Self-Destruction. Dave Morrison was motivational. The summer he left school, most of his classmates spent in idleness. He spent it in the coloured coat that showed he was an employee of the local holiday camp. The basic training, he called it later. It taught me there's no gain in being shy. You don't go forward by being backward, he'd say. Then he'd lapse from the rhetorical to the confidential. You have to hold people's attention. Of course, there are tricks of the trade. You learn them through using them. He'd look off into the middle distance memory. It's the world's best practical course. You have to live it though. You can't explain it. He held their attention because that's what he did, holding attention. But not like a neurotic attention seeker. This was the deliberate line. This was his routine. He was selling himself, or rather an image of himself, that hung loosely on his shoulders like a spiv's jacket. He was dedicated to it. He did it all the time, with everyone. Not just the people who mattered. He progressed well beyond the basic training. Dave pursued a more formal knowledge of persuasion, keeping records, reading rhetoric, noting what worked when and with whom. Practiced in the arts of persuasion, he'd not felt the need to diversify into more varied knowledge systems. As he said, the way to the improvement of my personal environment is through motivating competent people to achieve what they're capable of. He made no pretense of understanding what they were capable of, only that they could produce more and that a share of it was his for pointing it out. The holiday camp had provided initial exposure, an opportunity of more permanent employment and a useful myth. By the end of its season, Dave had a job lined up at an oil company hotel, used for hospitality and motivational weekends. For a boy from a low-employment seaside town who had never really taken school seriously, Dave was doing all right. It was the sort of place those who worked hard had a steady job, and those who stood out got preferment. Dave made sure he stood out. He could see the opportunities. It was not long before he moved upward and onward from the meeting, greeting and bag-carrying role he started in. Those who want to learn, listen, and he had overheard a casual remark from one of the speakers. Churchill went to Marlborough. He would have studied rhetoric there. That had started him on a search. His spare time was his own, with little to distract him in the isolated country hotel, and the web made it possible to pursue any particular interest. His interest was working knowledge of persuasion. He methodically went through all the rhetorical figures, making sure he understood each one, and then seeking out a practical application to see how it worked, be sure he had it right, and ensure he would remember it. He had not been interested in the subjects in school, but the ways of absorbing knowledge stuck, and this was interesting. He moved on and studied related things like movement and how to anchor words to movements, and when to use his left hand and when his right, and when both. He knew how to give a sentence urgency with repeated conjunctions, how to make it hang by leaving them out. The power of suggestion. His lack of actual message might have brought his career to a brisk halt, but he found a role as master of ceremonies, introducing other speakers. He used the general, avoided the particular, and created a motivational word fest that worked the audience up, the perfect motivational warm-up man for, well, anyone really. Dave didn't really care who, as long as they paid. Applying learned principles might have made some people stilted and awkward, and Dave's casual attitude towards accuracy or anything of substance could have made him trite and boring. But he had two natural abilities. Firstly, he kissed a Blarney Stone. When he spoke, it flowed and came together. Secondly, he listened and had an ear for words, language and phrases when he heard them. Occasionally he would note them down, but mostly he would remember them and incorporate them naturally. Jamie was a nerd who'd mostly inhabited a theoretical world. His father and mother were very proud to have a nerd as a son. They believed nerds were in high demand for their knowledge and abilities. They saw their Jamie could write a complicated computer program. To them, he dealt in mysteries, and they didn't realise it was a skill he shared with thousands of others. And that software companies shop in global markets. He did, however, have an advantage over most nerds. He had emotions, which he didn't mind sharing. He got involved with his fellow workers and he cared. He was a good person to have on the team. It was partly as a reward he'd been sent on a motivational weekend. Dave was giving the introductory speech. Who are they? He asked before going on. Computer nerds, was the reply. Not his usual middle management audience. He was unsure what their bag was, but he was aware that it was his business to get the punters hyped properly. He gave them the works. Looking for significant catchwords, he included algorithms. He knew it was relevant. He'd heard the term used by a computer man the week before, or rather he had heard algorithms, a heavy rock band, an electronic synth pop album and a recording company. Groovy. He'd wondered what such a hippie-sounding idea had to do with computers, but he'd been in too much of a rush to find out. Hippie-sounding meant it could be used across the board. Deeply embedded algorithms enhance most structures, he said in his wisest voice. Deeply embedded algorithms enhance most structures. His audience heard him, and by chance Dave had struck on something specific that made sense. The whole weekend had a considerable effect on Jamie, kicking off with that amazing speech. Dave was motivational. When Jamie thought back, it was hard to remember details. Dave's introductions were like that, aimed at motivation rather than learning. But he did remember the advice about deep-set algorithms. Advice from a man who made a speech like that was advice Jamie would take. Highly motivated, he wrote his next assignment programme dealing with pay, expenses, tax relief and staff financial matters, and built in algorithms, checks in the system which would pick up the smallest abnormality. Dave's was not a criminal mind. There was a lack of honesty, but he lacked the motivation to be criminal. His acquisitiveness was of the unthinking, everybody does it type. If he'd thought about morality, which he didn't, his little fiddles were just perks. He certainly failed to think about them enough to avoid Jamie's algorithms. The man who sacked him told him he was a fool who brought it onto himself. Right, wasn't he? Thank you. Yes, as I say, do sign on to the channel on YouTube, and hopefully you'll... And we're also on Facebook if you're watching on YouTube. Bye-bye.